Today we're looking into deeply twisted cases that should have never been allowed to happen in the first place. Normally, I try to put the stories I cover in order, with the most horrifying ones at the end, but the stories in this video are so bad that I honestly couldn't decide which one was the worst. So let me know in the comments what order you think they should have been in. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. The first story starts in 1965 with a young girl named Sylvia Likens. She was born between two sets of twins. Daniel and Diana were 2 years older than Sylvia, and Benny and Jenny were 1 year younger than Sylvia. Sylvia was described as pretty, confident, and very friendly, and she even went by the nickname Cookie. Jenny, on the other hand, was more quiet and withdrawn. Jenny also had a noticeable limp from polio and wore a steel brace on one leg. Their parents, Lester and Elizabeth, were carnival workers. The relationship wasn't super stable, and more often than not, they were on the road. They struggled to make ends meet a lot of the time. And to make things more challenging, Lester only had an 8th grade education. When Elizabeth and Lester were traveling for work, they usually brought their sons Daniel and Benny to help out. But this summer, they sent the boys to stay with their grandparents. Sylvia and Jenny were told to stay behind because of safety concerns, and their parents wanted the girls to focus on school instead. As a result, the girls would spend a lot of their time staying with family members, mostly their grandmother. Sylvia would often try to earn some extra money by babysitting, ironing, and running errands for friends while her parents were away. Unfortunately, Sylvia's parents consistently had financial problems, and in July of 1965, Elizabeth was jailed for shoplifting. This meant that Lester was the only one who could work at the carnival over the summer. With Daniel and Benny staying with their grandmother, Sylvia and Jenny were both sent to stay with a family friend by the name of Gertrude Banaszowski. When Gertrude was asked to watch the girls, she wasn't thrilled about the situation. She had very little money to her name, as well as 7 kids of her own to support. She had also been through a few divorces that involved physical abuse and sometimes dealt with crippling depression, so she was using prescription drugs to cope with the aftermath. Overall, she was really in no position to take in more children, but the Likens didn't feel like they really had a choice at that point. So Lester offered to pay her $20 a week for the care, and even told Gertrude to go ahead and straighten his daughters out if she needed to. Gertrude thought about it, and she could really use the money, so she accepted the job. The girls arrived at the Banaszowski home, and during the first couple of weeks, everything seemed to be going pretty smoothly. The girls were settling into their new situation, but not long after, Gertrude's oldest daughter, Paula, who was 17, started butting heads with Sylvia quite often. With a house full of children and 2 more being added to the mix, this is probably something you'd expect to happen. So nobody thought much of it. One week though, Gertrude's payment came late, and she was not happy about it. She lashed out at the 2 girls, yelling, "I took care of you 2 bitches for 2 weeks for nothing." And after that, she spat at them. In a fit of rage, she grabbed Sylvia by the arm and dragged her into a room. She closed the door behind them, and Jenny was left outside the room and couldn't do anything but listen to Sylvia scream. Of course, the money showed up the next day, but the damage was already done. And once it started, it never stopped. The abuse started happening in broad daylight, as if Gertrude wasn't even afraid of any repercussions. She was a small, weak, frail woman, but she had acquired a heavy paddle and a thick leather belt from one of her ex-husbands who was a cop. When Gertrude was too weak to discipline the girls herself, she had her daughter Paula step in for her. So of course, having already had problems with Sylvia, Paula and Gertrude ended up focusing the abuse mainly on her. Gertrude also forced Jenny to join in on abusing her sister. Otherwise, they threatened to turn the focus on her. And what happened next would serve as a very good reason for Jenny to try to avoid becoming the focus of the abuse. Gertrude accused Sylvia of stealing from her, and as punishment, her fingertips were burned. And on another day, the girls were taken to a church function. Sylvia was forced to eat hot dogs until she threw up, and as punishment for wasting good food, she was forced to eat the puke up off the ground. The vile acts aimed at Sylvia were nothing short of cruel, and the fact that Gertrude was able to get away with all of it in public is shocking to say the least. But unfortunately for Sylvia, these minor stunts were child's play compared to what she had coming. Gertrude not only allowed her children to participate in the abuse of Sylvia, but she actually encouraged it. The kids practiced karate on her, slamming her into walls and onto the floor, threw her down flights of stairs, used her skin as an ashtray, and even cut her open just to rub salt in the wounds. Following this, Sylvia was often put through what was referred to as a cleansing. She was forced to take a scalding hot bath, which would have been bad enough on its own, but with all of the extra cuts and injuries she had already obtained, we can only imagine how much worse it must have been. But later on, it crossed the line from bad to absolutely horrific. Paula had gotten pregnant, so to avoid punishment from her mother, she accused Sylvia of being pregnant. So now, not only was Sylvia subject to beatings, but the abuse was mainly focused on a few body parts in particular. The abuse got so gruesome that I don't feel comfortable sharing it on YouTube, but if the details are of interest to you, I have the links for this case in the description. What I will say is that following the abuse, Sylvia lost the ability to use the bathroom voluntarily, which of course only angered the mentally ill Gertrude. The normal abuse still continued. Sylvia was forced to lick dirty diapers clean that belonged to the youngest child of Gertrude. One night, Sylvia wet the bed, and instead of Gertrude taking any kind of responsibility for that, she blamed Sylvia completely and deemed her unfit to live with the rest of the children. Gertrude locked Sylvia in the basement and wouldn't give her access to food or the bathroom. To add to the already horrific situation, later on, Gertrude began to spread every story she could possibly think up in order to get local kids to join in on the beatings. She even told her daughter that Sylvia had called her a whore and got her daughter's friends to come over and beat up Sylvia. Gertrude even conjured up a story about Sylvia being a prostitute and had her 11-year-old daughter Marie and a neighborhood boy named Ricky Hobbs carve the words, "I'm a prostitute and proud of it," into her stomach with a hot needle. Sylvia's sister Diana showed up at one point to try and see how her sisters were faring under Gertrude's roof, but she was immediately turned away at the door. A neighbor had also reported what was happening to Sylvia to a public health nurse. When the nurse arrived, Gertrude claimed that she had kicked the girls out, and since she didn't see Sylvia anywhere because she was locked in the basement, the nurse concluded that nothing was wrong and she left the house. As for Jenny, she was beaten and threatened with abuse should she go to the authorities about what was happening to her sister. And the neighbors, who were also aware of the abuse, out of fear for their own lives, never spoke a word about it. For some time, the abuse continued without fail. Sylvia turned to her sister and said, "I'm gonna die, I can tell." But Sylvia wasn't the only one who knew that her time was running low. Gertrude was well aware, and in an attempt to cover her tracks, she forced Sylvia to write a note to her parents. The note claimed that she had run away with a group of boys that she was performing favors for, and afterwards, she had been beaten and mutilated. Gertrude's plan was to take Sylvia to the woods and leave her there to die. When Sylvia caught wind of this, she knew she needed to escape. She made a run for it, and when she got to the door, she swung it open and ran. Unfortunately though, due to her injuries and malnourishment, she didn't get too far past the front door before Gertrude caught her. Of course, with her attempted escape came punishment. Sylvia was beaten unconscious with a curtain rod, and when she woke up, she had her head stomped repeatedly. The absolute horror that Sylvia had gone through had left her in such a poor state of mental and physical health, she could no longer form intelligible words, and she could barely even move her limbs. Finally, on October 26, 1965, Sylvia died from a brain hemorrhage, shock, and malnutrition. Police arrived, and Gertrude stuck with her story, telling police that Sylvia had run off with the fictional boys and her scars and injuries were from them and not her. But Jenny couldn't stand by and risk not only Gertrude walking free, but being forced to go back into Gertrude's care after what happened to Sylvia. She knew that with Sylvia gone, she would be the main focus of the abuse from here on out. She waited until she could get close enough to an officer, and then she whispered, "Get me out of here and I'll tell you everything." And that's exactly what happened. Gertrude, her daughters Paula and Stephanie, her son John, and Ricky Hobbs were all arrested for murder. Participants around the neighborhood were also arrested for injury to person, and these minors would all end up blaming Gertrude for forcing them to participate. Gertrude pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, and several other children were simply too young to charge. However, Gertrude was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Unfortunately though, she was granted parole for good behavior on December 4th, 1985, and despite the protests, she was allowed to walk free. In the end, Jenny said she never blamed her parents for what happened to them, and she even said, "My mom was a really good mom, and all she did was trust Gertrude." Catherine Knight was born on October 24th, 1955, in Tenterfield, Australia. She was the product of an affair between her mother Barbara and a man named Ken Knight, who Barbara met through her husband. Catherine's father was a very violent alcoholic and abused Catherine's mother regularly, and Catherine was even a victim of the same type of abuse at the hands of several of her family members up until around the age of 11. Due to her violent upbringing, Catherine was a well-known bully around school. She terrorized children who were smaller than her. and without ever learning to read or write, she ended up quitting school at the age of 15. For about a year, she worked in a clothing factory, but eventually landed a job at a slaughterhouse, and she fell in love with it. Her job was to remove the internal organs of the animals. She loved her new job so much that eventually she hung up her first set of butcher knives over her bed. Later on, Catherine had her eyes set on a man named David Collette. David was a big drinker himself, and like Catherine's father, he was prone to getting into fistfights very often. But Catherine was used to that type of behavior after her home life, so it didn't faze her. She actually caught David by surprise one night by joining in on a fight he was involved in. The two seemed like a match made in heaven, but before long, David learned that Catherine was capable of much worse than a few good punches. Catherine went on to convince David to marry her. During the wedding, David was heavily intoxicated, and Catherine's mother warned him about her daughter's temper. She even told him at one point that Catherine had a screw loose somewhere. On the night of their wedding, the two had intercourse several times, and David fell asleep. But to Catherine, that was unacceptable. She wanted to go again, and David's exhaustion made her angry. She started strangling him in his sleep, but thankfully David woke up and was able to fight her off. Only a day into their marriage, there was already an attempt at David's life. The marriage was rocky from then on, and David wasn't very faithful to Catherine. And of course, Catherine didn't take kindly to this. In an attempt to hurt David in one of the most unforgiving ways possible, she took their 2-month-old baby and placed it on a set of train tracks. Thankfully though, the child was spared without injury. Following this, she was seen threatening people with a stolen axe and violently swinging her second child in a stroller down a busy street. Catherine was never charged for any of her actions, and instead, she spent a day here and there in mental hospitals following these violent acts. Eventually, she ended up spending about 3 months there, and in this time, she was diagnosed with postnatal depression. In the psychiatric hospital, Catherine had even told nurses about her plan to take the life of her husband's mechanic, because in her mind, having a working vehicle made it possible for David to leave her, and that was the mechanic's fault. Despite the threats, Catherine was released after 3 months, and shockingly, David even took her back for a little while. But not for long. David left Catherine, and the breakup hit Catherine pretty hard. But after a short time in 1986, she jumped into a new relationship with a man named David Saunders. Saunders was a local miner, and within a few months, Saunders moved in with Catherine and her 2 daughters. But even though he moved in, he decided to keep his own apartment. And of course, this only made Catherine jealous. Catherine was becoming increasingly suspicious of what Saunders might be doing in his old apartment. She wanted to make sure Saunders knew what she was capable of, and to send a message, she took the life of his 2-month-old puppy right in front of him. Remarkably, this didn't even scare Saunders away. The two had even had a daughter the next year, but shortly after the birth, Saunders finally left Catherine after she took an attempt at his life with a pair of scissors. Catherine then went on to meet a man named John Chillingworth. And I haven't been able to find any violent occurrences that took place during this relationship, and the two were together a few years and even had a baby boy named Eric. But when Catherine was caught having an affair, Chillingworth left her. Now with Chillingworth gone, Catherine's new man, John Price, was in for a real treat. And it was the most gruesome treat that Catherine had ever served up. Price had 2 older children, and they lived with him. The kids seemed to like Catherine, and Price made enough money as a miner to keep all of them pretty comfortable. Their relationship, unlike the previous ones, actually started out pretty smoothly. That is, until Catherine tried to convince Price to marry her. When he declined, it all started going downhill once again. In retaliation, Catherine conjured up a story that Price was stealing things from his company, which inevitably got him fired. And Price was furious. He left Catherine, but a few months later, the two ended up back together. But this time, Catherine's violence only escalated. In the year 2000, the couple were arguing, and Catherine tried to stab Price in the chest. And for Price, that was the final straw. He took out a restraining order on Catherine because he had his children to worry about, and fearing for his own safety was one thing, but he definitely didn't want to put his children in danger. Price even told his co-workers at one point that if he ever went missing, Catherine killed him. On the night of February 29th, Price came home from work and went to bed around 11 p.m. Catherine followed him home sometime later. She went up to the bedroom and woke up Price to have intercourse. And after that, Price fell asleep again. But Catherine didn't go to sleep with him. She grabbed a butcher knife, one of the knives from the set that she kept by her bed, and started stabbing Price violently. Price woke up during the attack, but he couldn't fight her off. And in the end, Catherine had stabbed Price 37 times and ultimately killed him. Things only got more sickening though. Feeling nostalgic, she dragged him downstairs, skinned him, and hung his body from a meat hook in the living room. After decapitating him, Catherine cut him up into small pieces and cooked his body in a dish along with potatoes, pumpkin, beets, zucchini, cabbage, squash, and gravy. She began eating her meal, but either she got full or she couldn't stomach it, and she ended up throwing the rest in the trash. Catherine laid down next to Price's corpse, took pills, and passed out. The next morning, Price didn't show up for his shift, and his co-workers feared the worst, so they called the police. When the police showed up, they were immediately confronted with the brutal scene that Catherine had left, along with Catherine fast asleep on the floor. She claimed that she had no recollection of any of the events from the night before. When police started walking the house, they eventually got to the kitchen and found Price's head boiling in a pot of vegetables on the stove. And when they looked around, they spotted 2 plates on the kitchen table. Both were labeled with a name and full of food. Yes, Catherine had in fact planned to feed Price's body to his own children. Catherine was quickly charged with murder. Not much more happened regarding the trial after she pled guilty, but the judge ordered her to never be released, and to this day, she's still serving her life sentence in Stillwater Women's Correctional Center. She was the first woman ever in Australia to be given a life sentence without parole. Thank you for making it to the end of the video. If you like these types of videos, along with any other horrifying topics, be sure to leave a like and follow the channel for more. And at this point, I'd like to add that if there are any other stories that you'd like me to cover, my email is in the description. So feel free to share them with me, and they may end up in a future video. This is FearBank, and we'll see you next time.